Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating, lifelong journey through human sexuality. It's a topic that literally touches every single one of us, yet it is so often surrounded by myths, discomfort, and, well, just plain misunderstandings. We're going to clear all of that up today by looking straight at the science of how we grow and change. To do that, we're exploring every major life stage chronologically to really understand how our intimate lives evolve. We'll start with infancy and childhood exploration, move through adolescence, hit the college years, dive into adulthood, and finally look at aging. So let me ask you a question to get things started. At what exact age does our sexual development actually begin? Think about it for a second. If you're like most people in Western societies, you probably guessed somewhere around puberty, right? I mean, that's a deeply seated assumption we have about the starting line of human sexuality. But here's the surprising biological truth. Babies are actually born with certain sexual characteristics already primed. It's a completely normal physiological fact that all infants are capable of sexual arousal in response to stimulation, literally right after birth. It's just hardwired into our biology from day one. Crazy, right? So that brings us to our first stage, infancy and childhood exploration. Now, I know many adults get super uncomfortable with the idea of children as sexual beings, but child development specialists are quick to point out that early physical curiosities are totally completely normal. It's like a giant puzzle they're figuring out. But it's absolutely crucial we contrast healthy childhood sex play with the intense warning signs that could indicate trauma or abuse. Normal behavior, that includes occasional touching or a natural curiosity about their peers' bodies, which usually peaks between ages 2 and 5 as they're learning about gender differences. But if that play involves coercion, explicit imitation of intercourse, persistent or intrusive behaviors, or honestly any pain and distress, those are major red flags that require professional attention. Now, what's really interesting about this is where kids actually get their information, because there's a massive disconnect here. Virtually everyone agrees parents should be the primary source. But let's be real, a lot of parents feel emotionally or factually unprepared, so they just avoid the topic entirely. And because parents avoid these talks, the data shows kids end up relying heavily on school, their peers, and the media for their knowledge on the big stuff, like puberty, STIs, and dating. Which leads perfectly into our next stage, adolescence, romance, and risks. Entering this incredibly turbulent stage, usually ages 10 to 19, we see a massive surge of biological changes colliding head-on with complex emotional, social, and cultural expectations. The physiological engine driving all of this? Puberty. The pituitary gland releases hormones that cause secondary sexual characteristics to develop, and reproductive functions kick into gear. But hey, it's not just physical. This flood of hormones drives brand new romantic feelings, and these early romantic relationships are absolutely vital. They basically spark the whole process of personal identity development and really help teens start to understand intimacy. But we all know adolescence can also be incredibly challenging, especially for marginalized groups. It is a heartbreaking fact that up to 75% of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered teens face harassment and bullying in middle and high schools. And because of this, these students often perform worse academically. That's exactly why there is such a critical need for structured school support systems. Things like clear anti-bullying policies, safe faculty members, and inclusive curriculums are just essential for protecting these young people. Now, when we look at physical risks, and this brilliantly illustrates the power of education, there's a really positive trend. Comprehensive sex education paired with better use of hormonal contraceptives and condoms has successfully driven down teen pregnancy, birth, and abortion rates consistently since the early 2000s. Basically, when teens have the facts, rather than just abstinence-only education, which time and again has been proven to fail, they just make better, safer decisions. Okay, moving on to our third stage. College. Freedom and consequences. As young adults step onto college campuses, they're entering a highly sexual environment, mostly defined by this newfound independence away from their parents. But to ground the risks of this freedom in hard data, just look at the massive spike in STI infections for the 15 to 24 age group compared to older adults. It's huge. While college-age students make up only a quarter of sexually active people, they actually account for half of all new STI infections. Half. So why is this happening? Well, mostly because these infections are often asymptomatic, and students simply avoid getting tested because they're embarrassed or afraid of the social stigma. We also really have to connect the dots between college social culture and intimacy.
There's a strong and frankly dangerous link between alcohol and sex on campuses. Alcohol is a pervasive influence that heavily contributes to irresponsible sexual decision-making. And even more critically, high levels of alcohol consumption can render a person completely incapable of giving consent, and that leads to serious, lasting consequences for everyone involved. Let's shift gears into our fourth stage, adulthood, partnerships, and satisfaction.
Leaving the wild experimentation of youth behind, adults in their 20s and beyond typically start looking for stability, mutual trust, and lasting relationships. Today, over half of U.S. adults have lived with a partner before marrying. A lot of people view cohabitation as a smart little trial run, but the data points out something quite surprising. People who cohabitate before marrying sometimes end up having less harmonious marriages and a higher breakup rate. Now, researchers suggest this might not actually be because of the cohabitation itself. It's more likely that those who choose to cohabitate just hold different baseline attitudes toward the institution of marriage in the first place. And despite all the changing trends, marriage remains the most common lifestyle choice. In fact, nearly 90% of heterosexual adults in the U.S. will eventually marry at some point in their lives. And what you should really take away from this is the profound link between intimacy and happiness in these partnerships. Studies consistently show that couples who report greater sexual satisfaction also report higher overall marital happiness. They literally feed directly into each other.
Of course, adulthood brings some major biological changes too, most notably menopause. This is a gradual physiological change that usually happens between ages 45 and 55, where the ovaries produce decreasing amounts of hormones and menstrual periods cease. And while, yes, this can physically affect sexual functioning, desire, and sometimes cause discomfort, it is so important to assure everyone that these are completely natural changes. Virtually all of these physical and emotional effects can be highly successfully managed and treated by medical professionals, so couples can absolutely continue to enjoy their intimate lives.
Which brings us to our final stage, aging, a lifelong journey.
We really need to directly challenge the pervasive societal myth that older individuals, folks in their 60s, 70s, and beyond, are somehow no longer interested in intimacy. It's simply not true. So the crucial point here is that while the physical response cycle naturally slows down and stages of response might take a bit longer, the capacity for pleasure and the deep human need for emotional connection absolutely endure. Desire doesn't just pack up and disappear. Single adults over 60 actively date, and their intimate lives remain a vital part of their overall well-being. Truly, the biggest roadblock they face isn't biological at all. It's society's discomfort with older adults being romantic.
Honestly, if there's one phrase that perfectly summarizes the ultimate scientific perspective on maintaining sexual and romantic activity into older age, it's this memorable quote from our source material: "Use it or lose it." People have the physical capacity for desire and activity throughout their entire lives. And continuing to engage in intimacy, both physically and emotionally, keeps those systems and connections strong, healthy, and vibrant.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and I want to leave you with a question to ponder. How has your perspective on lifelong intimacy changed after walking through this chronological journey with us today? We've busted myths from infancy all the way through to older adulthood. I'd really encourage you to reflect on how breaking these taboos applies to your own current life stage and the stages you haven't even reached yet. Keep learning, keep questioning, and thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer.